Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers execution call number 200, where developers talked about next steps for the PeerDAS devnets and talked about the urgency of figuring out a solution to Ethereum's history growth problem. And because it is ACDE number 200, I have prepared a little bit of a history lesson for all of my listeners on the ACD calls. I was racking my brain on what to prepare for this week's show because I wanted to do something special for ACDE 200, and I thought, you know what, let's keep it educational. So in the latter half of this episode, I'll do a little bit of a brief history review on how these ACD calls got started. Before we get started with the show, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. As per usual, developers started off the call with some Pectra devnet updates. By now, we should all of my listeners that have been tuning in for a while now should know how these calls generally run. It always starts off with the Pectra devnet updates, talks about any specifications changes that needs to be made on the next upcoming devnet, and then talks about new EIPs that developers are discussing either for implementation in the upcoming upgrade, which is Pectra, or a future upgrade thereafter. In this call, ACDE 200 was not so dissimilar. It started off with some minor updates, I would say, on Pectra DevNet 4 and Mekong. Pectra DevNet 4 is stable, and developers plan on trying to deprecate it soon now that they have the public Pectra testnet up and running. As I talked about during the last ACD call summary on the Infinite Jungle, Mekong is the very first public Pectra testnet that has gone live, and it is designed for application developers, wallet developers, anybody in the Ethereum ecosystem to have early access to trying out the new features of Pectra. And Mekong is based on Pectra DevNet 4 specifications. So right now, there's effectively two testnets that are based off of Pectra DevNet 4 specifications. It seems rather redundant, which is why the Ethereum Foundation DevOps team was talking on the latest call about deprecating DevNet 4 and moving all of the testing efforts for DevNet 4 specifications onto Mekong. There was one developer on the call, Geth developer Marius, who said he wanted to do some special testing on DevNet 4 through the DevCon conference. The DevCon conference is officially starting on November 12th. So because of that, Perry, one of the EF DevOps engineers, said that they will touch base again after DevCon to see when would be an appropriate time to shut down DevNet 4. Perry was talking about how there was one minor issue that they saw on the Mekong testnet so far, and that is the head vote percentage was extremely low. I'm gathering by head vote percentage that means the number of validators that are voting on the correct head of the chain, the most recent block. That participation rate was extremely low. Developers are looking into what was the cause of that issue, looking into debugging that issue over the next few days. Those were all the Pectra DevNet 4 updates that developers had to share. There were a few specifications updates that developers were talking about for Pectra DevNet 5, but I don't think they were all that important. So we're going to skip on ahead because we've got a lot to discuss on today's episode, especially if we want to do the ACD history part of the show. The other kind of interesting part of the call that I wanted to highlight some takeaways from was around the discussion on the next steps for PeerDAS devnets. On the last ACDC call, ACDC 145, developers were talking about activating PeerDAS as part of the Fusaka upgrade, starting to activate PeerDAS on devnets as part of the Fusaka upgrade. And I raised concerns about this, given that pre-dedicating certain EIPs to upgrades that are more than 6 months out from being worked on for developers has historically not been a great move for developers. This was one of the reasons why the Pectra split was so difficult to decide on, because Verkle had already been pre-planned for the Fusaka upgrade, but now Verkle is being punted off to some upgrade after Fusaka, and developers have kind of given a soft confirmation that PeerDAS and EOF will both be included in the Fusaka upgrade. So the chair of the ACDC calls, Ethereum Foundation researcher Alex Stokes, he raised the issue again on the latest call, and he was asking client teams if it would be possible for developers to move ahead with testing PeerDAS on devnets as part of the Fusaka upgrade, but without activating any of the other code changes included in Fusaka, i.e. the only other code change that has been included in Fusaka so far is EOF. So basically, Alex is asking, can we move ahead with testing PeerDAS in the Fusaka upgrade, but none of the other EIPs in Fusaka? Basically, can we not test EOF at the same time? And my main question around that continues to be why? Why split out the two upgrades? I had very similar hesitations and a similar question of why when developers decided to start rebasing PeerDAS on top of Pectra, because the 100,000 slot reorg that happened on a PeerDAS devnet happened with those PeerDAS specifications rebased on top of Denkun. And Denkun is the latest Ethereum upgrade that has gone live on mainnet. It is a very stable version of the protocol to be building the PeerDAS upgrade on top of. And so it makes testing and debugging PeerDAS, I would imagine, quite a bit easier than trying to debug and flesh out PeerDAS specifications on top of Pectra specifications, which continues to be evolving and continues to change. I think the real answer to why developers are trying to go ahead with the rebasing of PeerDAS on top of Pectra instead of Denkun, why developers are pushing to have PeerDAS be tested as part of the Fusaka upgrade, when the Fusaka upgrade, to be clear, the scoping for Fusaka upgrade has not formally started yet, as developers are still in the process of wrapping up the Pectra upgrade. The reason why I think some developers on the call, such as Alex, are pushing for this is because they want to speed up PeerDAS activation. They want to prioritize PeerDAS as one of the highest priorities alongside Pectra, and really kind of ensure that PeerDAS is the next immediate code change that happens on Ethereum after Pectra. And while I understand the urgency, I understand the anticipation for PeerDAS, I don't actually think that it's all that helpful to continue to push these kinds of changes for the PeerDAS development pipeline. I do think that there's quite a lot of stability and work that needs to be done on PeerDAS specifications on its own, and all of the work that will have to be done to have PeerDAS as part of the Fusaka upgrade, working alongside other code changes included in Fusaka like EOF, is going to have to get done anyways. So developers were talking about whether or not it's even feasible to start testing PeerDAS, but not as part of the Fusaka upgrade, but not any of the other code changes included in Fusaka. And for some clients, it's actually very easy to do that. Nethermind developer Lukash was talking about how for the Nethermind client, there is no such thing as a Denkun upgrade or a Osaka upgrade, like a name, like a label in which all of these upgrades happen all at once simultaneously. The individual EIPs that are included in an upgrade get activated at a single epoch number. So it's very easy for Nethermind developers to fine-tune which EIPs are activated at a certain epoch, at a certain time in the Ethereum blockchain. But for other clients, like the Geth client, all of those code changes are not individually scheduled. You don't schedule all of the EIPs going into Pectra with the same activation number so that they all activate at the same time. They are all activated at the same time under the upgrade name, under the header of like Denkun or Fusaka or Pectra. And there's pros and cons that developers were talking about on the call for either approach. And there are strengths and benefits to having a more fine-tuned approach to be able to activate a certain upgrade with 2 EIPs out and 2 EIPs in, versus having a more, I guess, bundled approach to activating upgrades through one single upgrade name. So that the differences in kind of approaches did illustrate that not all clients would be able to support the continued testing of PeerDAS, or moving forward, they wouldn't be able to support a testing style for PeerDAS in such a way where PeerDAS in Fusaka alone is activated, but none of the other Fusaka EIPs are activated. So developers then kind of moved on to discussing a different strategy to try and somehow make sure that PeerDAS is in the Fusaka upgrade, being tested like it's in the Fusaka upgrade, but just does not have any other dependencies with any other EIPs, which again is strange to me because those dependencies will have to exist anyways down the road at some point. But anyways, developers then moved on to thinking about another approach, another way to try and figure out a way to do this. And Tim, who's the chair of these calls, had suggested why not test the consensus layer part of the Fusaka upgrade separately from the execution layer part of the upgrade. This would definitely separate this would allow activation of PeerDAS in Fusaka without and separately from the activation of EOF, because the EOF part of Fusaka does not require any consensus layer changes at all. Now, if developers, after activating mainnet Pectra on mainnet, if they decide, oh, we'd like to include additional consensus layer focused code changes into the Fusaka upgrade, that means that these other code changes will have to be implemented alongside and activated alongside the PeerDAS code changes. And further, eventually, both PeerDAS and EOF will have implications and changes that are needed for the Engine API. Engine API is a piece of software that allows the communication between the execution layer and the consensus layer. So eventually, those two, it's not possible for developers to continue to test the Fusaka upgrade separately as a consensus layer only upgrade and an execution layer only upgrade. Eventually, they're going to have to rebase the two on top of each other. But for now, developers said that because it's so early on, and really the only consensus layer EIP that developers have agreed will be in Fusaka is PeerDAS, and the only execution layer EIP that will be included in Fusaka is EOF. They will continue to test out these two code changes independently from one another, but both as part of the Fusaka upgrade. And on devnets, they'll be able to activate Fusaka as a consensus layer only upgrade and activate Fusaka as an execution layer only upgrade. For now, until they, implement the changes to the Engine API, until they start adding in other EIPs that will impact either the consensus layer or the execution layer or both, which will then kind of complicate matters and will ensure that developers have to do a bit of work to make sure that their PeerDAS and EOF specifications are compatible and still working, and there's no bugs that they need to work out between the interdependencies of these EIPs. Again, I maintain that it's probably, in my mind, it seems easier to be able to test PeerDAS on top of stable specifications as a standalone EIP, and then when the Fusaka upgrade, the scoping for the Fusaka upgrade is complete, and PeerDAS specifications are more stable, to then move PeerDAS into the Fusaka upgrade. I would say that developers are one of the things that we can really take away from all this effort that's being put in now in the middle of the Pectra upgrade being still fleshed out and tested and some EIPs even in Pectra not having even been implemented yet on devnets. What we can take away for now from this discussion and from developers' desire to already start work on Fusaka is that PeerDAS is, in developers' minds, clearly a very urgent priority that developers are trying to ship as quickly as possible after Pectra. So yes, that's how developers will move ahead with PeerDAS devnets. They'll move ahead with testing PeerDAS as a Fusaka consensus layer only upgrade for now. Then another aspect of the call that I wanted to highlight was around a new EIP that was proposed. I don't think there's many calls that go by without a new EIP, and another change to Ethereum's protocol that developers want to make to improve the functionality and the resiliency of Ethereum. This EIP was related to extending the functionality of the Ethereum wire protocol, and in extending the functionality of the Ethereum wire protocol, offering a short-term solution to the problem of history growth. We've talked a little bit about history growth on this show before, but as a reminder, Ethereum's database of accounts and of transactions and blocks continues to grow. The current number of accounts, the account balances, the smart contract code, all of the storage that's held by that code, aka the balances and the record keeping of token balances, all of that is what developers call the state of Ethereum. And every time a new application is deployed or somebody creates a new wallet, the state grows. But the rate at which the state is growing on Ethereum is actually not as high as the rate in which Ethereum's history is growing. History refers to all of the prior blocks and all of the transactions contained within those blocks that nodes are keeping track of. And as you can imagine, there's a new block that's created on Ethereum every 12 seconds. The history of Ethereum continues to rise, and based on recent research done by Erigon developer Giulio Rebuffo, he says that by mid-2025, Ethereum nodes are going to have at least 4 terabytes of disk space in order to maintain the records and keep up with history growth, to keep up with the rate at which this part of Ethereum's data continues to grow. And for up until, I would say, very recently, the understanding was that a user could feasibly operate a full Ethereum node with 2 terabytes of disk space. So this doubling is something that could impact quite a few node operators and require these node operators to update their hardware. Of course, I would imagine that all the professional node operators are not worried about this at all. I can't imagine that any professional node operator is really operating with 2 terabytes of disk space right now. But there are, of course, home stakers, solo stakers, other kind of users that are not professional entities, but are really trying to contribute to the decentralization of Ethereum and operating Ethereum, connecting and verifying the Ethereum blockchain more out of the goodness of their own heart. These are the individuals that Giulio is concerned about. And so he proposed a solution, a short-term solution to kind of alleviate the problem of history growth and allow these users that are operating on 2 terabyte disk storage to still continue to operate even past mid-2025. There is a longer-term solution to the problem of history growth that developers are considering, and honestly, even more than considering, they really are trying to work on. Unfortunately, all the priorities that I've been talking about related to Pectra, related to PeerDAS, have kind of made the priority for moving ahead with the long-term solution for history growth kind of be on the back burner of developers' minds. The main solutions that developers have been trying to progress on is EIP 4444. Developers just call it EIP 44s, the 44s EIP, and the Portal Network. The Portal Network is an alternative, decentralized, peer-to-peer network that nodes could rely on to get history data instead of the node itself keeping all that history data. They can prune the history data a lot more frequently and access or redirect users that need access to history data to the Portal Network to be able to get the information that they need. There were quite a few developers that pushed back on the readiness of the Portal Network. So Giulio's proposal was, Giulio was suggesting that 4.4's EIP, the 4.4's EIP and the Portal Network are not going to be ready in time for mid-2025, which is why he's proposed his more short-term solution. But other developers on the call were saying that the Portal Network is ready. It's really the integration with clients that have not been ready. And the reason why is because client teams have not had the bandwidth to really start focusing on this. There were quite a few questions around, again, the readiness of the Portal Network related to the whether or not there's been audits done for the Portal Network. And it was clear that there was even some disagreement on whether or not Portal should be the standard way in which clients address the problem of history growth. Giulio and Ethereum Foundation researcher Ansgar was illustrating that coming to consensus about the history data of Ethereum is not actually needed for network to be able to progress the Ethereum blockchain. It's not a critical part of what nodes need to come into consensus with the broader Ethereum network. So it should really be up to client teams, was their point for how they implement history expiry, how they prune history data from nodes. So there was quite a bit of back and forth about, number one, the readiness of Portal. Number two, is Portal even the standard that all client teams should be using to prune history? If not, what are some other solutions that exist? Because the growth of history has been a problem for Ethereum for quite some time, and developers are clearly kind of overloaded with a lot of different priorities. Tim was saying that this discussion should continue asynchronously from the call, meaning there wasn't really a resolution that could be reached in the confines of an hour-and-a-half call. There was quite a bit of disagreement, and so developers did agree that during the developer conference coming up, during DevCon, developers are going to be meeting face-to-face, and this will be one of the conversations, one of the major topics that they'll be sure to discuss, paths forward for addressing history growth in the short term before mid-2025, so that users that are operating Ethereum full nodes on 2 terabyte machines can still continue to operate, hopefully. And then, of course, about the longer-term solution. Should clients really have no standard at all for the way that they prune history, or should the Portal Network and EIP 4444 be kind of the standard that at least all clients support, and maybe clients support a few additional other ways for history expiry on top of that that are more effective for a variety of reasons. So kind of an interesting discussion that I'm sure will be coming up again, especially once developers move on from Pectra. It could be a more important kind of bigger topic, bigger priority for developers as they look ahead to Fusaka. Those were the main takeaways from ACDE number 200. In the last couple minutes of the call, I wanted to do a fun little exercise with you. I went back to when the very first ACDE call was had on Ethereum. This is the way that key critical governance decisions about Ethereum are made. And in the 200 mark, I think it's important that we all look back on how far Ethereum governance has come in these past 200 calls. So here are a couple of quick fun facts about the history of these Ethereum ACD calls. So the very first ACD meeting that was recorded, there were notes from that meeting. There was no video, no like live streaming links or anything that have survived. Apparently, the very first meeting of Ethereum developers happened June 1st, 2015. Of course, developers, I'm sure there were the Ethereum founders and other developers were, of course, working on Ethereum far before June 1st, 2015. But if you look at the Ethereum GitHub repo, the very first kind of recorded call as under the label of ACD, the earliest date is June 1st, 2015. And during that time, they might have labeled it as an ACDE meeting, but it wasn't formally called an ACD meeting, and it didn't happen regularly. These meetings in the very early years of Ethereum's creation happened, months apart. They weren't recurring. They didn't have a specific format, no agenda. They were not, again, live streamed. So one of the first, I guess, like ACD meetings or notes that you can look back on and see recorded in the ACD meeting repo on GitHub happened on June 1st, 2015. And then, of course, on July 30th, so 2 months after that meeting, Ethereum launched on mainnet. So that was the birth of the Ethereum blockchain. Then in early 2017, the formal ACD calls were created. So I think it was maybe ACD call number 9 or 8 in the GitHub repo, where one of the chairs of the call, the chair I believe at the time was Hudson. I could be wrong about that, but one of the chairs of the call, the person that was moderating the meeting, suggested, how about we structure these calls as a bi-weekly recurring call where we meet up every 2 weeks to discuss protocol changes to Ethereum and decide, various aspects about Ethereum's protocol development, and to meet a Friday once every 2 weeks at 1400 UTC. And I will note, this is the universal time UTC. It's like the time zone that isn't based on any particular country, because all of these developers are working from different countries, and nobody has to this is a set time zone that will not be changing based on other people's, daylight time savings. And actually, daylight time savings was very recent here in New York. So when I was tuning in to ACDE 200, I actually tuned in an hour late to the call because while my time changed here in New York, the UTC time did not. So it was now the ACDE calls actually happen at 9 a.m. for me instead of 10 a.m. But anyways, so the ACD calls started happening on a regular cadence in early 2017. And in August of 2018 is when developers started to have a breakout meeting series for Ethereum's sharding roadmap, for Ethereum 2.0. Basically, the vision that developers had for the next major iteration of Ethereum that would be a lot more scalable. And at the time, developers thought they would scale Ethereum by partitioning and splitting out Ethereum into these mini blockchains called shards. They would make sure that Ethereum is this uber scalable blockchain first, and then they would transition Ethereum to a proof of stake blockchain from proof of work. Of course, those plans from August 2018, when they started having those breakout meetings, very quickly, rapidly changed into doing the proof of stake part of Ethereum's transition first. And of course, Ethereum's scaling roadmap changed and pivoted quite drastically from sharding and partitioning out the transaction throughput of Ethereum through these mini blockchains to the rollup-centric roadmap. But the Ethereum, I guess, ACDC calls had their origin in August 2018. And 4 years later, on September 15th, 2022, Ethereum finally underwent its proof of stake transition. Ethereum moved away. It replaced all of the miners of its protocol, and the block producers of Ethereum became the validators. And a couple of months after the historic merge upgrade happened, developers formally decided to name the two meeting series, the ACD calls that were happening on a biweekly basis on Fridays, and the ACDC calls that were happening on Thursdays. But of course, it wasn't called ACDC calls at the time. It was called ETH Sharding Implementers calls. To formally rename those calls ACDE and ACDC. And that's why the ACD calls became weekly, because now you've got an ACDE call happening once every 2 weeks, and then an ACDC call happening also happening once every 2 weeks, but on a separate one after the other. So that is what happened on January 2023. And then a year after the formal split of the ACDE and the renaming of the ACDC calls, in January 2024, the Infinite Jungle podcast started up, the very first podcast to cover these ACD calls and talk about takeaways from them. So from 2015 to 2024, there's been quite a bit of changes made to the ACD calls, and the governance structure, I would say, of Ethereum has come quite a long way. There's been I guess like broad strokes kind of takeaways of other changes that have happened more gradually over the years that don't really have a timestamp or a date. Since 2015, there's been a lot more participation on these calls, a lot more diversity of voices, different Ethereum stakeholders that are actively engaged in the ACD governance process. We're seeing increased number of client teams that are participating, as well as, of course, layer 2 rollups and other kind of ecosystem contributors like staking pools, all participating actively on the calls. There have been some handovers that I think is also important to note. So Hudson Jameson, who used to be the chair of the ACD calls, he formally handed over kind of the moderation of these calls to Tim Byko in March 2021. And more recently, Danny Ryan, who was chairing the ACDC calls, he handed over the moderating of the ACDC calls to Alex Stokes, Ethereum Foundation researcher Alex Stokes, in April of this year, 2024. And that, I think, is quite healthy. As I've said on some of these prior episodes, I think there's quite a bit of power that chairs of ACD calls have. So having turnover, similar to how you have turnover in presidential elections. You can't have a presidential election term that's longer than 8 years. I think it's actually very healthy to have turnover in who the moderator of the calls are. And I did mention that when these ACD calls started, they used to be on Fridays, and they continued to be on Fridays up until around June 2022. But there was a client team, the Lighthouse team, that is based out of Australia, and having those calls at 1400 UTC on a Friday for them really meant some awful weekends. And it was also awful for me too when I used to cover them on Fridays. So developers actually switched them over in mid-2022 to Thursdays, and that made both me and developers in Australia a lot happier. And throughout all of these changes, I would say the very one thing that has not changed about these ACD calls is that through all of the governance ups and downs, all of the conflicts, all of the crazy upgrades that have happened on Ethereum, some of the hacks and the bugs, the scalability concerns, the congestion, moments of congestion that have happened on chain through 18 different backwards incompatible hard fork upgrades. Some of the things that have not changed about the ACD meetings is that ever since they started to be formalized in early 2017, they have remained open and transparent and accessible for anybody to be able to participate on those calls directly or to listen in as a third-party viewer like myself. And I think that is so important that through many different market cycles and industry-wide events and evolutions that Ethereum has gone through. Ethereum remains a very open source and decentralized project. As a crypto project, it has the highest number of active developers working on developing the Ethereum protocol. And I think it's precisely because the Ethereum protocol and its development is very truthfully open source. And so there's many eyes, the highest amount of eyes, I would say, of any crypto project. The highest number of eyes and developers are looking into Ethereum. And I think that is one of the most compelling parts about Ethereum as a technology, in my view. It's that all of its development is so transparent and open source. And that, I would say, is probably the most bullish thing about Ethereum, in my view, that it is such a open source technology. A couple of quick programming notes about Infinite Jungle now that we're moving ahead to DevCon week, which is coming up or will be happening by the time you are listening to this episode. There is going to be a new Infinite Jungle episode tomorrow. Part 2 is coming out of my interview with Lido's Dmitry Gusakov. We talk about the viability of homestakers, a topic that I clearly cannot get enough of. So that's coming out tomorrow. But for next week's episodes, so after Dimitri's episodes, there will be no Infinite Jungle episodes. The show is going to be going on a 1-week hiatus, as I will be attending the Ethereum Developer Conference. There will be no ACDE call either, so there will really be no call to report on, no takeaways to report on anyways. And the show will be back. We'll be back after DevCon. Developers were also saying that the next ACDE call in 2 weeks' time is actually canceled as well, but instead they will have a testing call. I don't usually cover the testing calls. The testing calls happen on Mondays, and they're not usually part of the write-ups that I do. But if you are interested in seeing a summary of the testing call that happens on Thursday, November 21st, maybe leave a comment on the episode, wherever you're listening to this episode. Leave me a comment if you're interested in getting a write-up or kind of an Infinite Jungle takeaways on the testing call. And depending on interest, I can do that. So yes, so as a reminder, there will be an Infinite Jungle episode coming out tomorrow for part 2 of my interview with Lido's Dmitry Gusakov. But then afterwards, the show will be taking a 1-week hiatus. I will be back the week following with some takeaways from the DevCon conference, so please do stay tuned for that. Thank you for tuning in for another episode. I hope that you learned a lot of new things about Ethereum, and I hope everybody has a fantastic week. I am signing off from the concrete jungle that is New York City in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.